Hello everyone, and welcome to our video on parallelograms. So I'm going to divide this video into two parts. The first part is, what does it mean to be a parallelogram? And then we're going to learn how to draw the sign for a parallelogram so you don't have to keep writing out this long word, because that would get old pretty darn fast. So it's kind of a little slanted rectangle. And then the second part of our video is how do you recognize a parallelogram? So those are the two things that we are going to focus in on. So first, let's do a quick review about what does it mean to be a parallelogram. Well, a parallelogram has to be a four-sided figure. So it has to have four sides. And then it also has to be where opposite sides are parallel. Opposite sides are parallel. So that means that this top side has to be parallel to this bottom side, and this side has to be parallel to that side. If you have only one set of parallel sides, sorry, not a parallelogram. Both sides have to be parallel in order to be called a parallelogram. Okay, so let's see, what does it mean if we have a parallelogram? And this is the terminology that we're going to use here. We're going to say, being a parallelogram implies this. It implies that opposite sides are congruent. So both sets of opposite sides are going to be congruent, and that, you can imagine, is pretty helpful. Here's another thing that we know about parallelograms. Parallelograms imply that these two triangles formed by the diagonal, they are congruent. So triangles formed with the diagonals are congruent. Okay, so, and just to make sure that I'm not leaving anyone in the dust here, you could draw your diagonal the other direction and you would get the same thing, right? So either way you draw your diagonal, if you have a parallelogram, you know that those two triangles are going to be congruent. And finally, the last thing that it means to be a parallelogram is, if you are a parallelogram, then we know that this is also true. We know that opposite angles are congruent. The opposite angles are congruent. So that's a good thing to know. Now, when we are doing proofs, you do not have to write out, if you have a parallelogram, then opposite sides are congruent. One of the great things about mathematicians is that they don't really like English very much. And so you can just use this terminology. You can just draw a little parallelogram and an arrow that means implies, and then you can draw another little parallelogram with the feature on it that you are concerned about. So that's a nice thing to do. Okay, so now the next question that we are going to tackle is, how do you recognize a parallelogram? So these over here are like, once you know something is a parallelogram, then you know these other things about it. This over here is, how do you know you have a parallelogram to begin with? And there are three of these for you to learn. So the first one is that if you have opposite sides that are congruent, that means that you have a parallelogram. So we will say opposite sides if the opposite sides are congruent, then we know that we have a parallelogram. And notice that this is just a converse of what we already wrote over here, that opposite sides are congruent. Let me just back up a little bit, see if I can, oh, look at, I can get a little bit more on this page. Excellent. So that's just the converse, right? Here we say that parallelograms imply congruent opposite sides, and here is the converse, congruent opposite sides imply parallelogram. So that is awesome. The second one is just as awesome. The second one says that if you have opposite angles that are congruent, then you also know that we have a parallelogram. So opposite angles are congruent. And so again, this is just the converse of this one here. Now, unfortunately, the converse is not necessarily true, that if you have if you have congruent triangles on the diagonal, then you automatically have a parallelogram. You can't say that, but you can say this. You can say that if you have a four-sided figure and one of the sides, one pair of the sides is both congruent and parallel, then you know you have a parallelogram. So one pair of opposite sides is both congruent and parallel. If that is the case, then you know that the other side is going to be congruent and parallel as well. So it doesn't matter which side, if you do the top and bottom side or if you do the side to side side, it doesn't matter. But if you can determine that one side is congruent and parallel, then you get to say that you have a parallelogram. So this, notice that these are not the converse of each other. The converses are not true, but they are very helpful. And again, when you're making your proof, you do not have to write this out in English. You can just draw these little diagrams and everybody will know exactly what you were talking about. All right, well, that is your introduction to parallelograms. This is a very long chapter, chapter 6, and we spend a lot of time on parallelograms, so be patient with yourself. Okay, bye-bye.